Good morning. Welcome to our webinar session, our post-election discussion about what we think happened yesterday. I'm really excited to have Charles Stewart from MIT with us this morning. I think I've known Charles my entire career. It's been a long journey. Charles is the Kenan Sahin Distinguished Professor of Political Science at MIT. He's been there since 1985, and he's a fellow of the American Academy in Arts and Sciences. In addition to being one of the world's experts, maybe the world's expert on elections and election administration, he's also an expert on the politics of Congress, and has written extensively on American political development. As I said, he's one of the leaders, probably the leader, in understanding the performance of election systems and quantitatively evaluating election performance. He, along with me, helped found the Caltech MIT Voting Technology Project back in 2001, and Charles and I are currently the co-directors. Still, the longest standing project studying American elections, I think. But since then, Charles in 2017 established the MIT Election Data and Science Lab, which I think many of you probably know about. Since 2000, he's been working with our colleague, Nate Persily, at Stanford, and he then established the Stanford-MIT Healthy Elections Project. Before we start, I also wanted to point out that Charles, in addition to all that work, is a fantastic teacher. He's been recognized at MIT for his undergraduate teaching, and he's received a number of honors for that. So in any case, Charles, thank you for taking the time. I know it's been busy for you.
Hey, Mike, it's great being on. It's great seeing you. It's great talking to folks day after the election. It's great being reminded that I knew you when you were a grad student, and I had what was known as the Charles Stewart Jesus look, which I've since abandoned, alas.
Yeah, you've got that MIT professor look now, right?
Yeah, exactly. The bald MIT professor look.
So the really kind of fun thing right now is Charles is actually coming to us not from Cambridge, but from New York City. He has been at the CBS decision desk, and he's there right now. So can you tell us a little bit about the decision desk, how it works, and what your role is there?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. And I'm happy to start there. The first thing I'll actually say, and this is, I mean, I think this is relevant to a lot of the things we can talk about, is that CBS doesn't call it the decision desk anymore because, and I will put on the swag from last night, that the hat we all got,
Aha.
which says America decides.
Okay.
And and I noticed that I joined the data desk, which is now called, and in 2020. So I don't know when it changed, but it was around then when the major media, the networks and the big cable operations, got the word that um, that they needed to be very precise about what they were doing in reporting election results. And with one exception that I will not name, nowadays, all of the major large national operations are very clear that reporting election results, their unofficial election results until they're certified, that what they are doing is a bit of journalism, is reporting the facts about the results. The reason that we call a state or a race is in part I mean, it is part of the reporting and putting in context for readers and listeners what they're seeing. And I know that there are probably people on this call who wish we wouldn't do that, but I would say in response that if we don't do it, somebody else will.
Mhm.
And certainly, if you were watching CBS last night, and I'm sure if you're watching any of the other legacy networks, you would see a lot of explaining going on about why particular decisions were going on. So that's a lot of throat clearing. Let me just very quickly talk about what we do and how we do it. What we do at CBS is, in addition to just broadly being aware of what's happening with elections, on election night, we receive a data feed from Edison Research, which has been doing this for
Hmm.
decades and decades. They're kind of most famous for basically inventing exit polls.
Hmm.
And we receive, but they also have a data gathering operation that's very similar to one the Associated Press does that people may be more familiar with. And so they have stringers out. They're getting election returns from the counties, local jurisdictions as they're being reported. Nowadays, they're doing a lot of web scraping. I counted like 500 different websites that they were scraping on election night. We get a dashboard with those results coming in. CBS has then, over the years, developed statistical models that turn those results into predicted outcomes. We have probably a dozen different statistical models we can look at. Increasingly, and this is one of the things I brought to the team, we're trying to look beyond just the county and local results to the precinct results. So I have a team that gathers precinct returns from a number of states, and we try to look at the results, at the precinct level to see if we can discern patterns there. They're even more precise than the local returns. So we're getting those results during the night. There's a couple of permanent professionals who are analysts with CBS. They bring on about 8 others, myself included, some political consultants, people from who do kind of race handicapping, political scientists. Our colleague Stephen Salabaher, who was the first director at MIT, the Voting Technology Project, he's on the data desk as one of the consultants. And then there's a big technical operation, I'd say, of about 20 people. I haven't counted them all, who do the graphics and basically take what we're doing then and then push it out to the network, to the talent, the people in front of the screen. I'd say, we're in the old, I forget the name of the studio, but we were in the studio that got famous when MTV was first on the air. We're right on Times Square. And so there's the front of the house that the public was seeing. If you're watching CBS, there was a touch screen that was being used, and my battle station was directly behind the touch screen. That's where we are doing a lot of communication during the day. And yeah, we're trying to do our business. And in fact, the work still goes on. And I hope after I do this and go teach a class, I'll go back down and see what's happening as people kind of mop up the final races that we're covering.
No, that sounds really exciting. Does the team have to come up with some degree of unanimity? Is it a majority vote? I mean, how is the decision made to call a state?
Well, what we have, one of the things is that, so we're getting the data feed, and we're getting basically the data. If you were to go on the New York Times and you were to, click and get the full view, although, I mean, they get the AP feed, but it's very, very similar. So that's the beginning of the data. I mean, that's the beginning of the data, but we're getting other things. For instance, we're getting detailed reports when we can about the vote mode. And so how many votes are coming in by mail, early in person, election day? What's the breakout there? We have estimates about how many votes are left outstanding, and which in some ways ends up being an algebraic thing, right? It's in fact last night. One of the states ended up being called. We were wondering, should we call this? Should we not? And then the estimate of the number of kind of turnout in the state was reduced enough that it became impossible for the second place finisher to take the lead. And so we declared that state at that time. And so, we have all this data. We have the statistical models that are modeling the probability that the second place finisher can overtake the first place. A network like CBS, we are less interested in calling the race than in telling the story.
Mhm.
So we will be among the last of the networks to call. But by the time we call, it will be because, oh, and one of the things on our dashboard, we can do all sorts of scenario analysis. So right now, if I were down there, I could, for instance, Arizona is outstanding, and it's probably going to be outstanding for several days.
Mhm.
I could go in and I could say, well, what happens if rather than 55-45 for Harris and Maricopa County, what if the outstanding vote comes in at 60-40 for Harris or at 50-50? You kind of play with those scenarios and you rely on the statistics. You want to be kind of really in solid footing, but you also want to rely on kind of these counterfactuals.
Mhm.
Nobody wants to make news for calling it wrong.
Mhm.
And CBS News has not called it wrong in a long, long time. And very few media outlets have. And we're much more conservative in calling races than I think the public realizes.
Mhm. So before we start to switch topics a little bit, I just wanted to remind folks who are on, if you have questions that you want to ask Charles and I, please pop them in the Q&A or in the chat. Um, so last night, you're sitting there watching all this data come in, and you're at this wonderful, I mean, get this wonderful opportunity to see it as it happens. I think that things went generally smoothly, right, in terms of how the election was run. What's your take on why that happened last night? Because I know a lot of us, every election, we're worried, right, about the conduct of the election. We're worried about glitches. We're worried about meltdowns. Why is it that we worry about this and yet things seem to go so smoothly in this particular election?
Yeah, that's a great question. Before answering it, I should also note that I was lurking in another project that I helped to put together and that you were participating in, which was something we've now called the election night boiler room, where we invite, I think we had about 60 political scientists and law professors from around the country on a Zoom room and a a Slack channel, sharing information about what we were hearing personally or in the local news about what was happening.
Mhm.
So our experience in part is drawn from what our colleagues were telling us last night. So to answer your question, why were things so smooth? Well, I think the first thing is, and this is a dirty little secret of election administration, elections are run smoothly, mostly.
Mhm.
At the same time that elections have all sorts of craziness going on because of the logistics and because you're dealing with human beings in a very short period of time. My observation is election administration is sort of like watching ducks in a pond, right? They're kind of furiously paddling underneath and then they're smooth on the top. So there's always things going on, but election officials are very detailed oriented. They're very adept at going with the flow and dealing with all sorts of contingencies that come up. So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing is that it really started in part in 2000, I suspect, but it is ramped up. And the thing that's ramped up has been the scrutiny the election administrators are under
Mhm.
and the challenges that they're under. They have responded to the challenges, starting with 2016 and foreign interference, in 2020
Mhm.
with the pandemic,
Mhm.
and really, that community came together. I would say the larger election administration community, not just officials, but academics, nonprofits, governments, in many places. And so the current generation of election officials are battle tested.
Mhm.
They went through 2020. They got through it. The primaries were shaky, and there were all sorts of things that I think we wish we could have had a do-over on.
Mhm.
But by November in 2020, the community came together, and the community really has learned. Election administrators really have learned
Mhm.
how to do a whole bunch of things in this changing environment. But I would also just want to reiterate that we've had these conversations after 2016 and 2018 and 2020 and 2022 and now 24, remarking on how well the election appeared to be administered. And sometimes the public believes this and sometimes the public doesn't.
Mhm. So do you think they're going to believe it after this one?
I hope so. I haven't seen I haven't seen much widespread kind of denialism. I've seen
Mhm.
a few things pop out, a few conspiracies pop out. I've
Mhm.
seen, I would say kind of random, um, kind of continuation of the voting wars
Mhm.
reports. But I don't see a whole lot of it at the moment. And I think part of the reason is that since so much of the energy around there came from Donald Trump's supporters, that they won.
Mhm.
And
Right.
I think in some ways, what I worry about is that um, I know that some people over there, and I'm
Mhm.
not talking about all Trump supporters, but there's a cadre whom I believe will use this victory for Donald Trump as evidence that there was a lot of fraud, and that
Mhm.
if you really scrutinize and um, if you really scrutinize, you'll we'll squeeze that out, and we need to do more of it.
Mhm.
So I think that's going to come. But at the moment, when your guy wins, then it's a whole new ballgame with
Mhm.
respect to trust in the elections, and that's where we are right now among the mass public. But the entrepreneurs who make money and get attention by claiming fraud, I worry that they're going to find new ways to exploit uncertainty.
Mhm. Okay, so do you think then, though, just to push on this a little bit harder,
You know,
that this is going to be the election where we see voter confidence kind of return, and people, both Democrats and Republicans, become more confident in the process, and in some ways we can maybe declare a minor victory on that front?
okay. I'll be the yes and no.
The
Here's
academic
the
response.
Yeah, well, here's the yes, and this betrays some of my cheekiness in the last year or so.
Hmm.
So I give the standard talk to the public about voter trust, what we know about trust in elections, and the two biggest factors influencing voter trust are, first of all, personal experience,
Hmm.
which almost everybody has a great personal experience, so they really trust their own vote and
Hmm.
their home precinct and those sorts of things. Um, and they actually three things: their own experience. Secondly, if their guy wins,
Hmm.
and then thirdly, the interpretation of the election from their trusted politicians. And my cheeky, what I've been saying is, if all you care about
Hmm.
is increasing answers to surveys about whether you trust the elections in America, what you want to do is make sure Donald Trump wins,
Hmm.
because right now his strongest supporters are the most skeptical. And so we're going to see those numbers go up among Donald Trump's supporters. And I don't think they're going to go down much among Democrats. And so trust will be back up there. Will it last? I actually suspect Nirvana has not come for the following reason, and that I think these election results also set up some legislative and public relation conflicts over what to do next in
Hmm.
terms of policy. And um, I think the big one right now has to do with citizens voting
Hmm.
and the general state of the voting rolls. And it may also redound to renewed interest in voter ID.
Hmm.
And I think that one of the things that I've discovered in doing my own research around election reform is that actually just the fact that you're arguing about election reform can reduce trust, because you part of that debate is making the argument about why things need to be reformed, what's wrong with the system. And so to say advocate for um, greater greater assurance that we don't have non-citizens on the rolls,
Hmm.
we're going to start to see even more systematic and frequent claims that the voting rolls are full of non-citizens, of which there is no evidence. And so I think that that's going to be the countervailing force here.
Hmm.
And then also, I think with the defeat of Kamala Harris, there will be a voice on the left, taking up the drumbeat of suppression
Hmm.
and appealing to another audience. And so I mean, no guarantees here, but I can see the seeds
Hmm.
being planted that could lead to a decline in voter trust and confidence in the next few years, given the politics that will unfold.
Hmm. Right. So I'm gonna want to jump forward to that in a second, but there's a good question that popped up, which I think is really quite relevant here, which is that we don't really know what turnout is in this election right now. You may
Right.
have a pretty good guess though for what you think turnout numbers might look like. One of the things I've been hearing, in sort of the scuttlebutt, is that the sort of turnout estimates from last night are being compared back to 2020 and
Right.
actually being used by both sides to argue that there was suppression, or that in this election, or that back in 2020 there was massive fraud.
Right.
Do you have a sense for what do you think the turnout numbers are going to look like for this election? And how do they compare to 2020?
From what I gather, from the returns I've actually seen and from the turnout estimates that we have relied on, that I've created myself, I when all the votes are counted, I can see about 157 million votes,
Mhm.
which is about what it was in 2020. Um, and then a couple of things for the listeners to keep in mind is that as we're sitting here on, you know, mid Wednesday afternoon Eastern time, California is only about 60% reported. Washington State is about 60% reported. I think Colorado maybe is, I mean, those are a little higher, but there's a lot of West Coast states that are only partially reported. And then other states, have, a lot of ballots to report as well. And so don't use, I mean, don't use the current turnout numbers. Um, um, why is turnout down? Well, I think it's because we're kind of reaching the limits of how high we can drive turnout.
Mhm.
In 20, I mean, you can only have so much energy for an apocalypse for only so long. And I think, you know, campaign professionals and political scientists recognize that we're now really trying to get really kind of dyed in the wool,
Mhm.
as they say, low propensity voters to the polls. That's hard work to do, and I think we're just kind of at the limits. And
Mhm.
turnout goes up and down from election to election. I mean, there's also the other issue, and it'll be interesting to see the comparison between the battleground states and the non-battleground
Mhm.
states. But we've reached such a corner solution in how campaigns, the national campaigns operate,
Mhm.
that unless you have a really hot state race, governor or senate, something like that, the get out to vote operations in non-battleground states are really pathetic. Well, I don't want to say pathetic. I
Mhm.
appreciate people trying to get folks to polls, but are really limited compared to the
Mhm.
operations in the battleground states. And so that's going to be a natural break on
Mhm.
what turnout's going to be is that you don't have a scorched earth policy getting people to vote in Massachusetts.
Hmm. Or California.
Or California. No, exactly. We're exporting our citizens to battleground states to try to turn out voters there.
Right, right. So as long as we have this small constellation of battleground states, we'll sort of stay at this equilibrium or dip below it.
Yep, yep, yep. No, exactly. Yeah,
So
no.
I'm sorry, I don't
No,
want
no, I was going to say Texas may be the next frontier. So if Texas really becomes a battleground state, then it might go up a little.
to. So that's an intriguing idea. Do you think that's likely? I mean, do you think that this election showed that it's actually becoming more competitive, or it's about where it's been the last couple of elections?
I have a graph that people can find if they go to my Twitter, my X feed,
Hmm.
and where I've compared all the states,
Hmm.
their relative standing to the national swings.
Hmm.
And Texas is on the same road that Georgia has been on over the last 20 years. Texas is just about 2 or 3 election cycles behind Georgia. So I could see, I don't think Texas is going to be on the red side of purple, but I think it looks like it's coming into the purple zone in the
Hmm.
next presidential election or so.
Well, that'll be interesting to watch. Love that prediction.
Mhm.
So let's, again, I know you have to go and teach in a few minutes. I did want to fast forward or actually go back to something that kind of came up earlier, which is there's obviously new administration coming in, Republican Senate. We don't know what the House is going to look like, but there's a lot of chatter already about the prospects that there is going to be some efforts at the federal level to initiate, some election reforms. And I think you mentioned two already. The idea of requiring a citizenship for registering to vote and requiring perhaps the provision of government issued photo ID for in-person voting. Do you think that's likely? And do you see other things that might be part of that first, say, House bill or Senate bill that might be about election reform?
Yeah, I think it's got to be the case that an election reform bill with a low number gets filed in the House, just
Mhm.
what given the messaging at the end of of this current Congress around the continuing resolution is.
Mhm.
And I can easily see a citizen requirement for registration
Mhm.
showing up. Uh, Perhaps, I mean, if the Republicans take the same strategy that the Democrats took
Mhm.
in putting together their HR1, then I think there's a kind of clear the table bill that is citizenship requirement to register,
Mhm.
photo ID required to vote, um, um, excuse required for absentee voting,
Mhm.
and requirement that in federal elections results be reported in full by the Wednesday morning following election day.
Mhm. Okay.
I mean, I could imagine all of those being in a bill. Whether it gets to the floor, gets passed, and
Mhm.
all the rest, the political process will move forward. But it seems to me that those are the aspirational policies of a lot of groups. And if you were just stapling everything together that everybody wants, that's what you would get.
Mhm.
Um, I would suspect the politics to unfold as the mirror image, a reverse image, what happened
Mhm.
when the Democrats tried the reversed image of that bill, that there would be a combination of political realities, the pushback from local officials, and then just the policy, kind of the physical impossibility of some of these policies.
Mhm.
In the same way, I should note, I've been following state legislation over the last several years, and there's an interesting pattern in state legislatures from 16 to the present. There's been an explosion in the number of bills introduced in state legislatures,
Mhm.
but there has not been an explosion in the number of bills passed by state legislatures. Right. So there's a lot of messaging around election reform bills, but there's also a lot of very good reasons, political and policy, that we conduct the elections the way we do.
Mhm.
And those realities, either in public or behind the scenes, tend to kind of put a thumb on the scales for these reforms. But the final thing I'll say is that the citizenship issue seems to be so popular. Had about a half dozen initiatives passed this time around on it. That's something that it seems to me that members of Congress are going to be pressured by their constituents to move forward in some sort of federal legislation,
Mhm.
even if it's not bundled with other legislation.
Mhm. Okay. So that's something we'll have to keep our eyes on. Now we have a really good question coming from our colleague and friend Cameron Wimpy.
Ah,
And yeah, and Cameron, this is a great question. It's something that's on the top of my mind right now too, which is that Cameron's asking, what can we say right now about the 2024 election in terms of safety and security or other issues that came out of this election that are ones that we ought to put on the research agenda for election scientists like you and I and Cameron? What should
oh,
we be
great.
studying coming out of this election? That's a great question. I know.
Yeah, no, that is. Now I have to say, Mike, you sound like you were surprised that Cameron would ask such a great question.
No, I'm not. I'm actually I'm thrilled that Cameron's here and that he
Yeah,
he posed exactly the question that I wanted to ask you too. Pick your brain on
exactly,
this one.
exactly. Yeah, security, safety and security. That's, you know, that is a good question. And one of the reasons it's a good, two reasons. One, safety and security are absolutely an important thing in election administration.
Mhm.
And when I give my common spiel about what I'm interested in, and I say, my goal is to make voting easy and secure,
Mhm.
and you need both. Um, how to make it secure? Know, we think we know, but I think we know some things about making voting accessible,
Mhm.
although we know less probably than we think we know. But anyway, that's a part of this equation that I think social scientists and scientists and engineers have methods that make it relatively tractable for us to do the research, and we can get with partnerships with the election officials to try to figure these things out. Security is more, I say, more of a challenge.
Mhm.
um, you know the types of security that we want kind of start ticking off things. They range from kind of the macro security of girding ourselves against cyber attacks, foreign influence, those
Mhm.
sexy things, to more prosaic things that are also important, securing the vote in terms of making sure there's, not, people are, there's not imposters sending in
Mhm.
mail ballots and those sorts of things. And there's, as with everything, Mike, you and I have worked on over the last quarter century, there's the gadget component and then there's the human component,
Mhm.
right? So, think about the, making mail voting more secure. There's a string of things that we could do um, to make it more likely or less likely that there would be fraud committed
Mhm.
or mistakes committed that would interfere with people being able to vote. We could capture signatures better. We could verify signatures better. We could track mail ballots better. We could, there's a bunch of things that engineering, social science, we can work on. There's also the human aspect of things, which is, well, how do we train people to do good ballot verification? How do we set up workflows such that all of these things can be done in the limited amount of time we have?
Mhm.
And so anyway, that's the problem. But I started kind of ticking off the list, right?
Mhm.
Um, The final thing I would say, and this is the holy grail of all of these things, the role of technology, especially the role of computers in ensuring the security of the elections, is something I wish we did a better job about.
Mhm.
I will chastise my computer science colleagues a little bit in that I don't think computer science has been as sympathetic to the policy and operational needs of election administrators to be helpful in this regard. But I do think, nonetheless, I think this is an area where we really do need computer scientists to kind of join with election officials to work on securing all of the infrastructure that's used, from touchscreens to remote delivery to the verification of signatures and other indicia of people's identity.
Mhm.
So sorry, Cameron, I didn't give you a good list here, but I'm sure we'll come up with a good list at some
No,
point.
I think that's a great starting point, and I also would second what you just said that I think one of the things that has happened recently is that some of the energy from the computer science side, the cybersecurity folks, in terms of engaging in these conversations, but also engaging in this research effort, right,
Right.
has just disappeared, and I guess you and I need to figure out and strategize a little bit about how we re-engage them.
Yeah, I mean, this is a longer conversation. I mean, they're like little, little tinklings of efforts out there for re-engagement. But I think that I agree with you entirely.
Mhm. Well, great. I know that you're probably super tired and you have to teach as well. But thank you for your time today, Charles. It's great seeing you. And, I look forward to chatting more about, research agendas moving forward.
Likewise, research is what we should be doing, and partnerships between academics and election officials are what we should be doing more of. And I hope people listening to this podcast will reach out to you, will reach out to me. If you have questions that you want pursued, partnerships you want to develop to get us to do more of this work together.
Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly the right place to end. So again, thank you, Charles, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Uh, Cheers, everyone.